way to help him, because I'm guessing he's not very,
Yeah, I know, we talked,
Oh, you already-
we did a test.
Oh, okay.
And, my concern was that he was on Wi-Fi. The best strategy is Skyping off.
the video type, yeah.
Skype is bad enough. But we have a little intelligence that says he's not online right now. I'm not sure if we check his phone.
Have you heard Masha Gessen before?
Not in person, just in
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The idea is to get him on screen and while you're doing it.
Debate each other.
No, if it is, these were muted, so it's done. Oh, so you're going through your email? And you go on the web? So, once she has that number, just put out a Firefox. Oh, always Skype is running.
I didn't bring it. Bring any reading, but the current issue of
You'll do it. Q&A. So if Q&A is finished.
no one put something like that.
Turn off projector, because that will make the screen go up. Turn the lights on, turn everything come down. I could drag close the laptop. Sure.
But I never think. Defending.
I just emailed him, I don't know
And you're on,
what else to do.
Different perspective.
hold on. Now you see me down there at the little, can we get rid of me? Like, yep. I hear you. Do you hear me? That's probably probably the best way to do this. We hear you. All right. So am I framed okay? Does this suit you?
Yeah, it looks good.
I,
So actually, Stephen, if you see the four icons under your image
under my picture on the screen,
of us,
I just see you.
okay, do you see any icons? Because if there's a video camera icon, you can click that, and that will make the little image go away.
That would be located right under the image of me.
So you're seeing us big screen and yourself.
Oh, you're gone now. I see LP.
Okay.
Oh, LP, and I see myself. Now I see. I sure do, and it's a fine-looking group of people.
Okay. Is this it here? Oh, what?
Yeah, this
All right.
podium mic will be.
Okay, well, I guess we should get going here, folks. My name's Bill Wohlforth. I'm a professor of international relations in the government department here at Dartmouth College, and it's a distinct pleasure to be introducing Stephen Cohen this morning. I'm not going to waste much precious time in going through a discography of Steve Cohen's greatest hits, but this introduction does give me an opportunity to say something of a personal nature, which is I met Steve Cohen in 1988 when I arrived on the campus of Princeton University as an assistant professor of politics. And I joined a department that was, shall we say, not always the most welcoming to a younger professor. I was 28 years old. And this is an opportunity to, in public, to thank Steve Cohen for being an unfailingly supportive mentor during my time at Princeton University. Far more important, though, is the role that Steve Cohen has played in this country's debates about our relationship with the Soviet Union and Russia. From the Cold War to the first new Cold War of the 1980s, to the debate over whether we should meet Gorbachev halfway in ending the Cold War, to the heated debate over shock therapy in the U.S. and Western relationship with the post-Soviet Russia, and on to the present day as we debate the descent into what might be called a new Cold War. Steve Cohen's voice has been distinctive, has been important, and has been, in many of these episodes I've recounted, prescient in what was going to happen to U.S.-Russian relations. And so it's a voice that is important, deserves to be heard, and which I am very, very pleased we will have the opportunity to hear today. So please welcome me please join me in welcoming to Dartmouth virtually or electronically Stephen F. Cohen.
So Bill just got himself into trouble. It's fairly clear, following that really nice introduction, that he doesn't Google. Because if he Googled, I'm told, I don't Google either, that if you hit Google Putin apologist, I come up first, and there are, somebody told me, several thousand such designations. It's kind of him to leave that out, but he alludes to it when he says that we have I wouldn't call it a public national debate yet, but we have some discourse that's too toxic about American-Russian relations today, and we gather and you may have discussed this yesterday, at a particularly perilous time. Whether we think it's wise or not, as we speak, the United States and NATO are carrying out an unprecedented military buildup around Russia, on land, in the air, and in the sea. I shouldn't say it's unprecedented. And whether you think this is a good idea or a bad idea, and I think it's a reckless idea personally, without cause, it's important to know that in Russia today, it is said and discussed that this is the first time such hostile military force has been amassed on Russia's borders since the German invasion in June 1941. That is not, particularly with the 71st memorializing of the Din Pobedi, of the victory on May 9th, the kind of perspective that we want Russians to have in their mind. And I think that's a kind of backdrop. Maybe you've discussed it. I have no more to say about it at this moment. I really regret that I can't be with you, and physically I could not get to Dartmouth today, but I'm really pleased to participate because not only to get those nice words from Bill Wohlforth, who was the best junior, he's no longer a junior, I noticed, colleague that I ever had at Princeton. And though I have to say that he did go around in classes and elsewhere explaining that the real cause of Russian expansionism was a search, I don't remember the technical word, but for a surfer's wave that, and you all may have heard this in Dartmouth, that Russia didn't have, and that it was actually expanding in search of this surfing wave. I don't know whether it found it or not, but I wish I was with you because so far as I know, your conference at Dartmouth is the first actual debate format discussion of the new Cold War at any major American university or college. All the others that have come to my attention have been one hand clapping. And the hand clapping has been Washington and NATO and the people who think that their policy is correct. So I am happy to be with you, and I hope that the precedent you set today spreads to other colleges and universities. I need to say that I've never done a presentation by Skype before, and I feel very awkward. I don't know exactly how to do it, except that I'm supposed to look at this little green dot. But in order to stay within the 30 minutes, I need also to look at my notes, as I'm now doing. And so you'll forgive me if I turn away from you from time to time. I also need to look at my notes to stay within my 30-minute time limit. And to do that, I'm going to speak very generally. I'm going to make five very large generalizations, 5 points. I realize they're a bit didactic, the way I have to state them, and they're elliptical. And I hope we return to them in the discussion. And I'm particularly eager to hear the discussion or points of view from people who think that what I now say is wrong-minded, incorrect, or worse. I think that's the discussion that needs to be had. So let me turn to my 5 generalizations. I begin with a word about myself because all the abusive language directed at me during the last 3 years loses, in my mind, what I think is important. I see myself, and have for many years, as a patriot of American national security. I care primarily about policymaking in Washington. I know that Russian policymaking is exceedingly important, but Russians are all grown up now, and they've got enough running room. They don't like the policy being made in the Kremlin. Let them argue about that and bring what pressure they have to bear on their own rulers. After growing up in the Jim Crow South in Kentucky, I've spent nearly 50 years studying, living in, writing about, teaching, sometimes with Bill at Princeton, primarily Soviet and post-Soviet history. That was so during Soviet times, and it's so today. That means for me, and I want to formulate this right, that an American president needs a partner, not a friend, a partner in the Kremlin. All this back and forth between Yeltsin and Clinton about best friends and good old boys was pointless. We now know what was really going on behind the scenes. And when Putin came to power and the second President George Bush looked into his soul and saw a guy he liked and had him to a couple of Texas barbecues, that was not what we needed. What we needed was talk about security partnership. Now, each of you in the room may see a threat, because there are multiple threats in the world today, that you think is the most dangerous threat. But when we are told repeatedly by Obama's military commanders, and on one occasion, almost by President Obama himself, that Putin's Russia, and I quote here, is the #1 existential threat to America and the West today. That is above the Islamic State. They list all the alternatives, North Korea, American commander of NATO, General Breedlove, and by the current Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter. So that is basically official policy, that Putin's Russia, which is how they refer to it, is the #1 existential threat to America today. I don't think this was remotely true. For me, the #1 existential threat is a combination of international terrorism, not only the Islamic State, but all its smaller affiliates, including the Nusra Front in Syria, but combined with this proliferation of zealot civil wars, ethnic, religious, that's come upon us in the 21st century, plus the quest by these terrorist groups for some kind of radioactive material. I don't worry they'll acquire an actual nuclear weapon, but I worry they're very close. And in fact, the New York Times had a story about this about 2 weeks ago when they investigated the terrorist acts in Paris and Brussels, that is their priority. And they had a plan to get radioactive material. So we know what that means, that if on 9/11, those planes had had radioactive material on them, I, who live way away from the Twin Towers on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, still would be unable to go into that part of New York or parts of New Jersey. So to me, this is the existential threat, and there is no way we can diminish it without having a partner in the Kremlin. So a security partner. So that's my first point. My second point is that the chance for a partnership between the White House and the Kremlin did once exist after the Soviet Union ended. But sometime in the 1990s, it was lost or it was squandered. And that is a discussion in itself, that it was lost so badly that today we're in a new Cold War. Now, when I began saying about 10 years ago that American policy was leading toward a new Cold War, no one less than then Secretary of State Condi Rice said I was wrong because that was impossible. Russia was too diminished, too weak, too isolated, ever to participate in a new Cold War. And yet now we talk, many people won't use the expression for their own political reasons, but you've given that name, New Cold War, to your conference, and I think rightly so. My third point, though, is even more dire, and that is that this Cold War, and I think it began at least in 2008 with the American-Russian proxy war in Georgia, but that's for historians to sort out when it began, that this new Cold War is becoming more dangerous than the preceding 40-year Cold War. And I can't see, looking at my monitor, how many of you in that room are young enough for this generalization. I see quite a few people who appear not to be. My kids, sometimes say, "Dad, what was it like during the Cold War?" And my answer today, it's great. If you're a teacher, I say, just look around you. It was sort of like this. But that this is not only potentially, but becoming more dangerous. than the 40-year Cold War, that, and here's the generational generalization, that many of us here today survived. Why is it potentially more dangerous? Well, you probably know. First of all, the epicenter, the political epicenter, is not in faraway Berlin. It's right plunk on Russia's borders. The epicenter was originally, and it remains, I think, fundamentally, in Ukraine, but it's spreading to the Baltic states. This is a big difference, and you can just let your imagination range back to all the provocations during the 40-year Cold War and imagine those happening now on Russia's borders and the potential for a tripwire to actual war. In fact, I think we might be approaching one. The second reason it's more dangerous is there's no rules of conduct. Now, I hate to make this generalization with Bill Wohlforth in the room and the others of you who specialize in international relations. And if I'm wrong, Bill will say so. But I think that after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the two nuclear superpowers developed, and I think formally, but also informally, rules of conduct, red lines that each side had that would not be crossed. And it was those rules of conduct that saved us, that avoided nuclear war or a major shooting war on land. There are no rules whatsoever today, none. And we see this every day in the behavior of both sides and in the dialogue between the two sides. I mean, already we have had 3 American-Russian proxy wars with the potential of becoming something much worse. First in Ukraine, then in Syria, and now possibly in the Baltics with this big American buildup in the Baltic Sea and on land and on air. There's something else very important, because I entered public debate about American-Russian relations in the late 1970s. At that time, there was a debate, the so-called pro-détente versus the so-called pro-Cold War groups in America. But it was a real debate. Today, there is no anti-Cold War, pro-détente movement in the United States whatsoever. Not in the think tanks, not in the universities, not in the mainstream media. That point of view cannot get on the op-ed page of the New York Times, Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. And plenty of people, more distinguished than myself, have tried. Forgive me, Stephen Myers, if you're in the room, but this is a fact. There's a shutdown there. There's no debate. Back in the 70s, we, the pro-détente side, had allies in Congress, in the State Department, even in the White House. Certain presidential aides were known to favor our point of view. So we had a fair hearing. And it is said we lost that debate, but I would say that we helped prepare the way for the grand debate between Reagan and Gorbachev that began in 1985. But that too's for historians. But the fact that we have no debate is exceedingly dangerous. We're racing towards something unprecedented, maybe, and we have no public debate. And finally, there's this demonization of Putin. This is beyond rational discourse. He has been vilified in this country systematically, daily, in Congress, by the president himself, in our major newspapers, on television, in a way that no Soviet communist leader, to my memory, was ever vilified, at least after Stalin, personally. And what this has meant is that it is very difficult for American statespeople, John Kerry at the moment, for example, to get any kind of traction in Washington for any kind of cooperation with the Russians. The atmosphere that derives from this demonization of Putin is simply toxic. It's one thing to call me a Putin apologist for my arguments, but newspapers have referred to Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski as appeasers for proposing a negotiated settlement in Ukraine. And even Obama himself for meeting with Putin. So we're in a place which, to my memory, we've never been before because of this demonization of Putin himself. It's been personalized. And when we talk about Russia in the media, we talk about Putin's Russia. It's all been personalized. My fourth point is actually a question. And probably you all have discussed this, or you may have yesterday, and you might today. Who's responsible for this new exceedingly dangerous Cold War? Now, we know in history that rarely ever is one factor, one side, one person, one thing responsible. I used to tell my students at Princeton when we discussed things like we were now looking back, the Vietnam War. I would say, look, here are 5 factors that historians give for how we got into the Vietnam War. Your assignment is to find a book advocating each of those factors and write a short 6-page paper telling me why that factor is persuasive or not and what it leaves out. And when we turn to Russia, I'd give them the same format, Bill will remember, about the rise of Stalinism. Was it Russian history that produced Stalinism? Was it Lenin? Was it the struggle of the 1920s? Was it Stalin's personality? We know that history is multi-causal. So the question becomes, though, who is primarily responsible for the new Cold War? Virtually the entire, and I've been writing an article on this, so I've been through the material, at least going back to 2008, virtually the entire bipartisan American political media establishment tells us that Russia, and primarily Putin personally, is responsible for the new Cold War. He's solely to blame. Now, think of the implications of that. It isn't true, but let's say it is true, or it's thought to be true. That then means that we Americans have no need to rethink, reconsider, and still less revise any of our policymaking toward Russia since the end of the Soviet Union. If we bear no responsibility whatsoever, there's nothing to discuss, and we soldier on, just as we are, and that could be exceedingly dangerous. I don't agree with this interpretation, and if any of you have read either, not only what I published in The Nation and what I said when I was still permitted on mainstream television back in 2014, when I said nothing more complicated than the old adage that I was taught at home down in Kentucky, there are 2 sides to every story, and there's a Russian side to the story. That's been ruled out. That's been ruled out. What happened, I think, and I've set this out in 2 books, Failed Crusade, published in 2000, and Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives. I forget when it was published, maybe 2010. There was a later paperback edition. I've argued that the Clinton administration, in the spirit of we won the Cold War triumphalism, undertook a winner-take-all policy toward Russia. Winner-take-all. And that fundamental policy, which was bipartisan in the 1990s, has been the bipartisan policy of every administration and every Congress since the 1990s, Republican and Democratic. And it has led to policies on the part of Washington that deeply aggrieve Moscow. Let me give you the 4 examples that you probably would list as well. Obviously, the decision to expand NATO, and not only expanded, but all the way to Russia's borders, to the Baltic states. Russia now sits right on Russia's borders. Someone said that this is the largest, because we're always going on about Russia wants a sphere of influence and they can't have one. Someone remarked that NATO expansion is the largest expansion of a sphere of influence in peacetime in history. That is, the American sphere of influence, military, but with military comes political and culture, expanded from Berlin to the Baltic states in a generation. So the Russians obviously have been provoked by that. But it wasn't only that. It's been the refusal to negotiate missile defense. Missile defense, by the way, which Reagan offered to negotiate with Gorbachev. Missile defense is now a NATO project. So as NATO expands, along the way, I think probably sometime in the early 1970s, excuse me, but when we say that we're coming to Russia's borders, and much of the missile defense is now on the sea, that Donald Cook warship that caused the controversy last week had missile defense capability on it. When we say that NATO has come to Russia's borders, it's come with missile defense. And we refuse to discuss this with Russia. So that has been something that's deeply aggrieved them. Then there's the whole issue of what is loosely called democracy promotion. I won't go into this except to say that Americans, including the American government, have been more deeply involved in internal Russian affairs since the 1990s than we ever would have permitted Russia to be in our own country. This is a double standard beyond belief, and it's highly provocative, and it's improper. Russia's internal political business is their own business, but we are there big time, and nobody should have been surprised when Putin began to either shut down NGOs funded by foreign agencies or make them declare themselves, it was an unfortunate choice of words, foreign agents, because it evoked the Stalin era. It would have been enough to say we get foreign money. That's all they needed to say. But these are aspects of American policy to which I think Russia has been reacting for nearly a generation. And there's one other thing. There are very serious, I would say profound, official, White House level, broken promises to Russian leaders. This is a serious thing in international affairs. It began, of course, we all know, people can talk around it, but we certainly know that Gorbachev was told in 1990-91 that in return for a united Germany and NATO, NATO would not expand eastward. That's a broken promise, but we don't have to go that far back. Russia was told, Medvedev was the president then, that if he did not veto at the Security Council the no-fly zone resolution over Libya, that nothing would be done to remove Gaddafi. And in fact, within days, we and our NATO allies were tracking him down and leading the jihadists to him, who then sodomized and executed him. That's a broken promise that Putin still refers to today. So these are American actions. Now, you have to ask yourself in this context, this historical context, two questions. Are there in fact two sides to this story? Is Russia really solely responsible? If not, then we need to have a public discussion about what we caused to go wrong in Russian-American relations since the end of the Soviet Union in 1991. And even more fundamentally, and for me, this is a kind of not metaphysical, but more than geopolitical question, does Russia today have any legitimate national interest rights outside its own borders, even on its own borders? Or are we the only nation that has legitimate rights around the world that warrants 800 military bases and a global presence? And Russia has none. And obviously, the question becomes, does it have any legitimate security interest in Ukraine? Did it have such in Crimea? Does it in the Baltic states? If the answer is no, let that be said officially. Russia has no rights whatsoever abroad, national security rights. But nobody will say that. But policy appears to be made on that basis. And then there's this issue of demonizing Putin. The core of the argument, and again, forgive me, Stephen Myers, but daily virtually, on the web or the print edition of the New York Times, no matter what's being discussed in Europe or say Syria, we come upon the phrase, Putin's aggression or Putin's aggressive policies. I think that future historians, when all, if there are any, when all this crazed discourse has passed, but is in the archives, or I guess you don't need an archive, you go on your computer somehow now. When future historians read this description of the aggressive, ever aggressive Putin, they may well conclude that in fact, Putin has been from the beginning, from the year 2000, less aggressive than reactive. That he's been reacting. Now, I would agree that he's reacted unwisely. Certainly, I don't think he should have taken Crimea when and how he did. After the referendum, there were good options, and he didn't choose them. But the point is, the Crimean crisis didn't arise until the crisis in Kiev arose. He was reacting. He may have reacted unwisely. But I think historians might look back and see a Putin, at least abroad, who's been a reactive leader. And in fact, in Moscow, and those of you who go to Moscow and talk to people at medium or high levels know that there is a complaint articulated. And in fact, it's broken out in the Russian press just last week that Putin has been too soft, too reactive toward Western policy. Now that's been a high level, behind the door Kremlin conversation. Now it's public. And the argument is the West is preparing for war with Russia and they use this expression, for 16 years, Russia has been unprepared at home and abroad for this war that's coming. Who's been in power for 16 years? You don't have to mention Putin's name. It's been Putin. So this issue in Russia, that Putin has been unduly reactive, not taken the initiative, not been aggressive, is a point of view that has to be considered. Finally, my last point. It's really a sappy point about we have to carry on. I call it prescriptive hope. I think the opportunities for having the partner we need in the Kremlin have either faded or are fading quickly, but I think they still exist in three vital areas. In Ukraine, as you all know, there's still the possibility of implementing the Minsk Accords to negotiate an end to the Ukrainian civil war, which it is fundamentally, though it's become a proxy war. And remember, this is not Putin's plan, but a plan devised by Merkel and Hollande and signed on to by Putin and Poroshenko. That still remains a possibility. Who has thwarted it is worthy of discussion. The second possibility is in Syria. I have thought since Paris, just as Hollande said, that we need a grand coalition with Russia to fight the Islamic State. And Putin has repeatedly proposed this. So I suppose that possibility, though it too is fading, remains. And then there's the existential question of nuclear proliferation. The end of Nunn-Lugar was a very bad thing. The Russians withdrew for their own political reasons, but they've offered to renegotiate it. As you know, Nunn-Lugar meant to lock down and secure all Russian weapons, nuclear weapons and materials, and scientists, and with terrorists in quick pursuit of such materials. And Russia still being a kind of Walmart of such materials. We really need to renegotiate a version tomorrow of Nunn-Lugar, which the Russians have proposed, but the Obama administration has refused. To end, Kerry, to his great credit, Secretary of State Kerry, and Lavrov, to Lavrov's credit, and beside Lavrov stands and sits in the room when Kerry goes to Moscow, Putin himself. So we know Lavrov has Putin backing. They have made some significant cooperative progress on two of these new Cold War fronts, primarily in Syria, as you know. Not only the Geneva so-called peace negotiations, but without telling us, there's been military cooperation in Syria. Not enough, but some. I say that Kerry and Lavrov have carried out a mini détente, or are trying to. But here's the thing, just as happened in the 1970s and 80s, against détente is a Cold War, hot war political faction or party in Washington and Brussels. And they have stabbed Kerry in the back every time he moves forward. And Putin, Obama has not had his back, at least publicly. So my own hope is Kerry carries on. I guess I just made a pun. And that Putin doesn't withdraw Lavrov's willingness to travel along this road with Kerry. I do think this. I think that despite all that's happened, Putin personally, as a leader, desperately wants still a partner in the White House, because Cold War is not compatible with his historic mission. He came to power with a Russia that was in near total collapse. Getting its back on its feet at home is his historic mission. And he says it almost every time he digresses from foreign affairs. He wants this ended, I think. There is a precedent, and again, in living memory, but I look around the room now and I think the majority of you remember this. There is a precedent for such leadership in very bad times. 30 years ago, the most Cold War president in American history, Ronald Reagan, did nothing more than meet Gorbachev halfway. And the two men carried out a détente so far-reaching that both men wrote in their private diaries, "We have ended the Cold War." They thought they had by 1988, 1999. They thought they had ended the Cold War. Well, either they were right and a new one began, or they were wrong, the old one never really ended. I don't know about that. But it is a precedent. It can be done, but it has to come from the top. I guess the last thing to say is that the ongoing American NATO military buildup around Russia, land, air, and sea, causes me personally, and people I know in semi-high places, despair. Despair. Why is this being done? Where is it leading? Where will it stop? And where will Russia, full of memories of June 1941, how will they react? I think we're approaching a tripwire from cold to hot war, and there needs to be a pullback. But I end where I began. There is absolutely no debate about this. There are just reports about it and explanations that it's in response to Putin's aggression. One would have hoped that during this presidential campaign, one of the umpteen, I think there were 21 candidates originally, presidential candidates, would have sought a public debate about America's Russia policy. And not one did. That's not true. One now has, Donald Trump. Well, you may laugh or you may cry, but the reality is that only Donald Trump has questioned American policy toward Russia. I guess that's the way to end, as I now do.
Well, we have time for questions, and I think we have microphone-wielding, nice young people who may not have been alive during some of those events that Steve described. So please raise your hand, and a microphone will be brought to you forthwith. Of course, the first person to raise his hand is the most inaccessible spot.
If you could write the script on an appropriate foreign policy at this point, what would it look like? Because there are certain elements of Putin's behavior that have to do with his personal style that make it very difficult for us to be sympathetic to him.
Your voice, and I know it's not your fault, Sounds like one of those beheaded souls in a horror movie. It kind of frightened me. And I think you asked, if I could write a script for American foreign policy toward Russia today, what would it be? Well, to me, because the epicenter of the new Cold War is Ukraine, I would, the United States has not formally been part of the so-called Normandy Four, France, Germany, Russia, and Ukraine, that has designed and is overseeing the implementation of the Minsk agreements, which require certain things to be done by the Kiev government, by the rebel government in Donbass, and by the Russian government. I would, were I advising President Obama, urge him to put his personal authority behind the implementation of Minsk. I say that operating on the assumption, and I have no reason to doubt this assumption, but I could be wrong, that Washington pretty much controls the Ukrainian government, funds it, gives it the essential political support it needs, approves its new prime ministers or not, that Kiev is in danger of becoming a kind of American colony. And it's run through the office of Vice President Biden, that's clear enough. But I think it's time for Obama to put his foot down. It's too dangerous. The other thing, because it's really is the #1 existential threat, is I see absolutely no reason why there should not be a full-blown American-Russian partnership, coalition against the Islamic State in Syria. Now, the reason there's not, we're told, is we do not accept Putin's argument that without Assad's army, there are no boots on the ground, that we got to get rid of Assad. So we will not join Russia in bolstering Assad and bolstering his army. And that's where the political conflict is today. There are only two answers to that American argument. Okay, is Washington prepared to send fighting forces, excuse me, it's allergy season, sending fighting forces to Syria, comparable to those of the Syrian army, the Iranian fighters there, and the Kurds that are fighting with Russia in Syria. If we're prepared to send such a force, probably 30 or 40,000 combat troops, then we can say we don't need Assad. But otherwise, we do. And the choice seems to me to be simple. It's either the Islamic State in Damascus or Assad in Damascus. And I don't see how after Paris and Brussels, and even California, if that was actually related, any American policymaker could see that as a tough call. So those are the two places I would begin.
Further questions? No, we got other hands. It's just taking a while to get the mic there.
Thank you very much. It was a great talk, thanks. So the topic of this conference is New Cold War and media. And you mentioned a few times underrepresentation of your point of view in the American media. And you referred to New York Times a few times. So we sort of know how censorship works in, let's say, in today's Russia. But you sort of hinted that something, well, not similar, but there's some sort of analogous processes which prevent this point of view appearing in New York Times, for example. Could you sort of expand a little bit on this, sort of what are this internal mechanism of this? Is this clear?
Do I interpret the question, because the audio is a little fuzzy, do I interpret the question to be, do I see something comparable to Soviet or Russian censorship at work in the United States that prevents the opposing point of view regarding American policy toward Russia from appearing in the mainstream media? Is that the question?
Yes, or if it's not comparable, then what is the mechanism which fulfills these functions, in your opinion?
Well, to tell you the truth, officially and technically, there's no censorship in Russia today. And in fact, when Gorbachev came to power and he told Alexander Yakovlev, and I heard this from Yakovlev himself, it's in a book my wife and I did called Voices of Glasnost, interviews with Gorbachev's reformers. Yakovlev discovered when Gorbachev told him to go out in the censorship that there is no formal censorship in the Soviet Union. It's all informal. It's a zillion devices that had built habits, understandings that had been built up over the years. And you're going to have to dismantle the censorship entity by entity. And as you know, they started with the Filmmakers Union. And the reason they did that was that there were a dozen films on the shelf that had not been released. And they just, Pakayania was one of them, the film about Stalinism in Georgia. They just ordered them released. They could be done in a week. I don't think there's any official censorship in the United States or formal. But what I think has happened is that the 5 or 6 of us who have some kind of public name, it is understood that the point of view we represent, and by the way, it doesn't have to be our byline. It could be an unknown byline, as long as it's a strong argument against American policy. It's understood that will not appear on the op-ed pages of the major American newspapers. When Walter Pincus, was that his name, the guy who did all the national security writing for the Washington Post and who retired a month ago? Walter Pincus, right? His farewell column had a line that was interesting, that if you want to send a memo to the president or to Congress, you have to send it on the op-ed page of the New York Times, the Washington Post, or the Wall Street Journal. You will not find anyone remotely with my view on those pages. The Times sometimes puts things on its web or exiles it to its international Paris, but on the New York page. And I do not feel free to divulge the name of the person, but I can tell you that a person as eminent as possible, politically and otherwise, now retired, whom the Times op-ed page would otherwise very much desire for its page, had his piece rejected. Now, he published it elsewhere. And it was not the greatest piece in the world, but it was tight. He was ready to edit. They didn't want it. What goes on cable television is simply beyond belief, where General Wesley Clark, who nearly got us into war with Russia in Serbia, comes on regularly and equates Putin with Hitler. Mrs. Clinton equates him with Hitler. This is a kind of discourse that shouldn't be happening, but certainly requires a reaction. So a kind of culture of exclusion is created, and it persists. In my adult lifetime, since the invention, I think Harrison Salisbury created the op-ed page at the New York Times. And you should go back and read. Harrison was a Russianist, as you know. Spent much of his life as the Times correspondent in Russia. When he created the op-ed page, he wrote a manifesto of what an op-ed page was supposed to be. It was a place for people whose opinions were different from those of the New York Times editorial board and were different from majority opinion in the media. In other words, it was a page for dissidents. And it may still be on many subjects, though evidently not on Donald Trump, but many other subjects. But it is no longer and has not been for years. And that's true on Russia, and that's true. And I worked for CBS News for almost 20 years as its Russia consultant, on air and off air. And one thing I learned, and particularly since the foreign bureaus have been shut down, except by CNN, that television broadcasts, cable too, on Russia, simply do video versions of what's in the newspapers. They don't generate any stories or perspectives of their own. So what Walter Pincus said can be expanded. If you want to send a memo to the American people, you get it on the op-ed page of one of these 3 papers, and then within a week, in video and talking head form, it shows up on the cable talk shows. Make of this what you will. Russians are angry at each other, Russian intellectuals, because accusing each other of self-censorship. I think there's probably some self-censorship going on here too. But I'm not close to the editorial offices of media since I left CBS, so I can't be sure. It's simply a perception.
Thank you very much.
I mean, I will say that I would challenge any of you to tell me when last in America we had such a dire international crisis without any debate at all about the American possible complicity in the cause of the crisis. What comes to mind, of course, is the Iraq War. Now, some of us were against the Iraq War, and we lost that debate, but none of us can say that the media prevented us from participating in the debate. We were allowed on the op-ed pages of the papers, and we were on television and on radio giving the reasons why the invasion was attacking Iraq was a bad idea. We lost, but we can't say it was because there was no democratic debate. I think 78, I don't remember, but a large number of members of Congress also opposed it, including, I guess, Senator Obama, or wherever he was at the time. We had a debate. That's democracy. We have no democratic discourse about Russian policy today whatsoever outside the room, to the extent that there are many views unlike mine in that room. What's going on in Dartmouth now. That's bad. It's bad for American democracy.
All right. Another question?
Thank you very much for this very clear, very straightforward talk. I have a rather general question about something you said at the beginning, that the road to America's national security leads to Russia, leads to Kremlin. I find this argument convincing. My question is, where on this road would you place Ukraine? Would this road go through Ukraine? And would this argument, taken to its logical conclusion, mean that if worse come to worse, Ukraine's national interest is to be sacrificed for the sake of the partnership between America and Russia, and for the sake, perhaps, of the safer world? And more specifically, at the beginning, you said that for you as an American, American national security is the prime interest and the point of departure for thinking about foreign policy. What would you say to people in Ukraine for whom Ukraine's national interest, not Russia's, not America's, is the prime interest, as it should be? Thank you.
Well, it's a vital question, and if I understood it, to summarize it, how would my priority on an American-Russian partnership to solve crises in the world affect Ukraine? Would it victimize Ukraine? That is to say, would Ukraine be a victim of such an American-Russian partnership? Do I have the question more or less right?
Yes.
Yes. Well, I would say that today, the Ukrainian people, and this is reflected in demographic, economic statistics, as well as public opinion polls, and leave aside the Ukrainian people in Donbass and Crimea, but certainly in Donbass, because they too are Ukrainians, leave them aside. But those in the territories governed by Kiev are suffering terribly, in every way. Their ability to obtain nutrition, medical care for themselves and their children, sheer safety, is declining by the week. So I fail to see that Ukraine has gained anything from this crisis. The solution that I favor for Ukraine is the Minsk Accords, which would bring an end to the civil war. I mean, I understand this might take years to implement, but it's a road down which everyone should go. Poroshenko, as president, signed these accords. I understand he was forced, but I guess there's enough decency in the man to understand that it would be nice to be the president who ended this civil war and this crisis. And what Ukraine would get in return, and this would be an American, Russian, French, and German partnership, what Ukraine would get in return is, first of all, peace. Secondly, humanitarian relief for those who desperately needed it. Thirdly, a restitution, a rebuilding of its ruined economy. And international guarantees, because if the Minsk Accord is implemented, the final step is to be a United Nations resolution ratifying it with all these guarantees. And in the end, Ukraine, Kiev, would be given control of Ukraine's border with Russia. That's the last stage. So to me, it's win-win for Ukraine, this kind of American partnership, though I don't think the White House is a partner in the Minsk thing. I mean, let me tell you what, just to show you why I don't think that. Minsk, I think it's correct to say, does not even mention Crimea. It's solely about reintegrating Donbass through constitutional amendments and other things into Ukraine. That is, Donbass would no longer be separatist. It would be in Ukraine and internationally recognized and ratified as such. Crimea is not mentioned. And yet, 4 or 5 days ago, at the United Nations Security Council, the American ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Powers, said twice that the sanctions would not be ended until Crimea was returned to Ukraine. The European position is the sanctions will end when Minsk is implemented, but Minsk doesn't mention Crimea. So this is what I mean, that there's a war party in America sabotaging even the modest progress that has been made, because Ambassador Power either is totally uninformed about a vital issue she discusses regularly at the UN, Crimea, or she didn't tell the truth. But Crimea is not part of the Minsk process. So if we leave Crimea aside, I think resolving, and it's a civil war, resolving the struggle between the rebels and Kiev is good for all Ukrainians, except, of course, maybe right sector and their brethren on the very far right. I can't think of a reason why it would not be good for Ukrainians. Ending the dying, ending the suffering, ending the malnutrition of children seems to me to be a very, very transcending thing.
All right, Steve, well, we've come to the, pardon? Oh, microphone, yes. Steve, we've come to the end of this morning's session. I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to participate. I thought it was an excellent discussion. I hope the audience will join me in thanking you for participating today.
And I'm not invited many places, so thank you very much for the invitation.
And the technology even worked.
And it worked, yeah, it did work.
Okay, so folks in the audience, we're going to set up the next roundtable. There'll be like a 5-minute intermission, and we'll get the next roundtable underway.
I didn't run long. It was your technical problems that made me.
No, you're right.
And I understand you were in such.
хотел у нас трансляцию, рекламу, advertising, product placement. Yeah. Ой. Мне кажется, что лучше пусть потенциально.
Okay, welcome back. My name is Stuart Finkel. I am Associate Professor of History at the University of Florida, where I teach Russian and Soviet history, and I am visiting Associate Professor here at Dartmouth. I'll be teaching Soviet history again here this summer. It is my honor and also my daunting task to introduce a very distinguished panel and then to tell them that they each have 5 to 7 minutes to give us their expertise. All of them could talk for at least as long as Stephen Cohen and Masha Gessen, and yet we have told them that they have 5 to 7 minutes each to give their own take. We are calling this particular panel The Cold War and Media, New and Old. We have a diverse panel of experts that I will introduce all together, and then we're just going to go, for sake of convenience, from my right to my left, that is your left to your right, across the table. First next to me is Stephen Lee Myers. He is a correspondent, has been a correspondent for the New York Times for 27 years. He has been stationed in Iraq and was a Moscow correspondent for 7 years. He is the author of The New Tsar, The Rise and Reign of Vladimir Putin. Sitting next to him is Natalia Rostova from Moscow. She is the senior correspondent at the website Sloan.ru. She is currently a visiting expert at the Kennan Institute and a contributor to both Meduza and to the Open Democracy website. She is also the author of a website on the history of the Russian media under Mikhail Gorbachev, gorbymedia.com. Sitting next to her in the middle is Alexander Balnov. He is the author of WikiLeaks, Backdoor Diplomacy, published in 2011, and an editor-in-chief of Carnegie.ru, based in Moscow. From 1999 to 2003, he was in the diplomatic service in Greece. From 2004 to 2008, he was reporter and then editor of Ruski Newsweek, and from 2009 to 2015 was a columnist and editor also with Sloan.ru. He's been published, among other places, in Vedomosti, Bolshoi Gorod, and Ruskaya Жизнь. Next to him is Michael Gorham, professor of Russian Studies at the University of Florida and associate editor of both the Russian Review and the Russian Language Journal. He is the author of After Newspeak, Language, Culture, and Politics in Russia from Gorbachev to Putin, and Speaking in Soviet Tongues, Language, Culture, and the Politics of Voice in Revolutionary Russia. He recently co-edited Digital Russia, the Language, Culture, and Politics of New Media Communication, together with Ingun Lunde and Martin Paulson. His newest project is tentatively entitled Russia's Digital Revolution, Language, New Media, and the Unmaking of Civil Society. And finally, at the end of the table to your right is Eugene Rumor with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. Among his many other achievements is that he is co-author recently of Conflict in Ukraine, the Unwinding of the Post-Cold War Order. So as you can see, we have an incredibly distinguished panel, and we will now hear very briefly from each of them on their own perspectives on media and the Cold War, and my job will be to try to keep them to the 5 to 7 minutes. So we will start going with across the table with Stephen Lee Myers.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. It's a real pleasure and privilege to be here representing the New York Times in a debate over propaganda. As we think about the media and the Cold War, and I'm old enough to remember the first one as well as the new one, I think we should clear up some of our definitions, because even in some of the discussions we've had here already today, you can kind of see the blurring of lines. The thing I would want really to try to emphasize is that the media are instruments. Newspapers, television, radio, now the internet. Propaganda is the music that is made with instruments. And it's important to preserve that distinction. And, there are various news organizations in this country and in Russia that are called organs of propaganda. The New York Times, of course. I've been called a propagandist by, in fact, as recently as last night. And I've been called a propagandist for the Bush administration when I covered them and wrote about what they were up to. I've been called the same about the Obama administration. In Russia, I've been accused of being an apologist for the Kremlin, and I've been accused of being a Putin hater. And I think it's important to understand that I don't want to make the argument that because everybody's criticizing you, you must be doing something right. But there is an essence to that, an essential part, that the media, the New York Times, in my case, are an instrument for conveying information. That's what we do. And some news organizations do it better than others. I like to think we do it fairly well, trying to present a complicated world to our readership, which is, of course, American first, but increasingly globalized. And so when you talk about some of the discussion that we've heard this morning, I don't want to sound defensive, but I do take some issue with the notion that somehow the New York Times is, has taken a side in a debate, which is not to say we're perfect or that every story is perfect, but I think that there is a diversity of views. If you widen that to the new media especially, and the advent of the internet, the amount of information that is accessible to anyone who wants to find it, of all across the spectrum, any point of view on Russia or any other issue, it's overwhelming. You have so many choices. So the notion that there's somehow a narrowing of perspectives about Russia or about any other issue in the world, I think is misleading a little bit, because on the contrary, you can do much more to that. One of the questions we were asked to address was sort of how the new media, that is social media particularly, fits into this, and specifically the promise of democracy and spreading democracy. And I think that confuses the issue in the same way. The new media is actually a great format. It's a great social media, YouTube, Twitter, the way people are able to communicate enormous amounts of information, social media, iReporter kind of stuff, eyewitness accounts from the ground. These are an incredible asset to anyone who's trying to understand what's going on in the world. As one of my great colleagues, Chris Chivers, once said, what Twitter gives you is facts. It gives you reports. What you do with that is journalism. And I think that is an important thing to understand as well. The cell phone played an important part in the uprising in Egypt, for example, or across the Arab Spring, but not because the media was somehow taking a side in that issue, because both sides can use this new information, and I think you see that very much. As we move into this Cold War, I think a lot of people are tempted, and it's easy to see you know, the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or Vedomosti or any of the newspapers, news organizations out there essentially taking sides. And I admit, you know, in some respects, media has become more partisan, I think, but nonetheless, I think that you can judge each of these organizations on their own merits and on the credibility of their reporting. You don't always have to agree with it. You sometimes will read something you find to be misleading, you know, fair enough, but it's wrong to think of them as participants in the Cold War in some respects. I think it's more important to see them as observers of it, chronicling it as best they can. The last thing I would say, because I'm already running out of my time, is that you know, Steve Cohen is right that there is a consensus view on Russia. It's not a universal view, though. I disagree with him on that. I think there is, in fact, quite a bit of debate. And I can't actually speak for the New York Times op-ed page because it's not my responsibility to do that. And I also have nothing to do with it. But so I don't know why Stephen Cohen's op-eds have been rejected. But I would dispute that there's a one-sided view. And I would recommend to you looking up an article that was called A Plea for Caution from Russia. It appeared on September 11th, 2013, and its author was Vladimir Putin. So the notion that somehow Russia's point of view is not getting across is, I think, a little bit misleading. And I'll close by saying there was a former journalist, Angus Roxburgh, a British guy who, great journalist, who went to work for the Kremlin at one point, around the time of the Georgia War, in fact. And he wrote a book called Strong Man, which was basically about his time in that job and working with Putin and his media apparatus. And at one point, with some frustration, he disputed the notion that many in the Kremlin have, and by the way, I would say some in probably every government in the world, including ours, shares this, that they seem to think that they had a PR problem, and that if they just had the right PR mix, they could solve it. Roxburgh, in frustration one day, said, "You might have better PR if you had better policies." And so this was a man who worked for the Kremlin. So, and I'm sure those debates, as I said, happen in Washington and many other capitals. And with that, I look forward to questions. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation. I cannot help myself not to argue with Stephen Cohen. He told us that there is no censorship in Russia, and I have to argue with that point. Officially, the censorship is prohibited. It's the Constitution Article number 29. But since November of 2014, there is also an official censorship which applies to the internet. Since that time, we have a situation when the governmental agency makes a list of prohibited websites. So if it's not censorship, then what? I've been covering media in Russia since 2002 for almost all time since Vladimir Putin came to power, and I witnessed how we came to this situation we are having right now. He started with taking over two main TV channels in Russia, which were ORT and NTV in 2001, 2002. And now we have a situation when, for example, foreign persons or foreign companies cannot have more than 20% as owners in Russia of the media. We have censorship of the internet. We have all the time dangerous situations with journalists who has been killed or threatened. We have a lot of journalists who just leave the country or get a political asylum. So it's really hard to work under those circumstances, and there are less and less media which are free from the Kremlin agenda, which can cover objectively what's going on in Russia. But I have to admit that there are still very brave journalists and media outlets which provide a lot of stories from Russia to the world, and they do even sometimes a better job than the Western media working in the country. For example, I can say about Panama Papers. We do not have to forget that the Russian part was done by 4 investigative journalists working in Russia. So it's not the situation as it was in the Soviet Union yet. We had a broken taboo of the Putin's family, the coverage of the Putin's family, which happened in January 2015, which was done by RBK, a Russian media outlet. After, probably I have to say some words about it. So it was an article about Ekaterina Tikhanova, who they say is the daughter of Vladimir Putin. So since from the very beginning of his rule, we didn't know anything about his family. We almost never saw his daughters. We didn't know anything about his private life. And RBK wrote a huge article on her. But it was one point they didn't mention, that the story was covering. The story they didn't mention that it was his daughter. So there were other media and bloggers who had to admit that it was her. My point is that we are having situation which is worsened, but still journalists exist in Russia. But the audience of those media outlets is very small. So I do not know if it will be possible for the whole population to understand what's going on in the country. There are about 7% of people in Russia who can access to all the media, who can read, and who do it. So the majority of Russians have one source of information, one channel. It's a TV channel. It's about 50%. Recently, some people, so there is a growing number of people who do not trust TV, but still they do watch it. And all the media which are remaining free now, which are critical to the policies, have the audience no more than 5% of people of the Russian population. And thinking about Cold War, I just don't know what policies should imply. I'm just a journalist covering the media. I'm not a policymaker, but my idea is that prohibition of information of the journalists coming to the West should not be done. We see the situation where, for example, journalists of the state media are not allowed to come to some countries in the European Union. We know that Ukraine does not allow some Russian journalists to come, and the same applies to Russia, which prohibits of some experts and journalists to come. I I would vote for breaking those prohibitions because I believe that it should be a free discussion.
So my capabilities to make long speeches in English are probably less than my experience as a independent first paper and then internet journalist, editor-in-chief in Russia. So probably it's just better to, in my case, to give more time to questions. But I make one short remark because it's planned. We have heard from many top-level Russian officials that internet is the CIA project, special CIA project, with the scope to overturn or to change the regimes. And the general convinced idea in Russian leadership is that the main goal of the Western politics towards Russia is the regime change. So if we see and take in account this view, which is very widespread and or very top level of Russian officials, internet should scare Russian political leadership very much and should be completely censored, which is not the case. Actually, the last year, so the year 2015, is the first year that Russian internet was declared unfree. And really there are changes, so changes towards worse direction. But still, internet in Russia is much freer than many other undemocratic countries. Nothing to compare with China or Iran, or even we didn't see the attempts to block such widespread resources as YouTube or Facebook or Twitter, as we have seen in a country like Turkey, which is an official candidate to the European Union. So that means that Putin has cautions about the internet, but he doesn't fear it really. And the reason is quite simple. When he came to power in 1999 as a successor of Boris Yeltsin, there were 5 million internet users in Russia. During his campaign in 2008, there were 33,700,000 internet users in Russia. When the protests of the winter 2011-2012 took place in Moscow, there were 70 to 75 million users. And now there are more, around 100 million. If we compare this line, this graphic, with the line of Putin's popularity, we see that the increase of internet users doesn't affect his popularity at all. I mean, the peak of his popularity and the peak of internet in Russia actually coincides. And during the protests in 2011-2012, the internet played a role, of course, but the titles about internet revolution or Twitter revolutions apply to what happened in Iran or Arabic countries or Ukrainian protests. are something to sell better the articles and the news. Because if that were just, how to say, listovka? Yeah, exactly. On the streets, how it would be called? Again? Flyer revolution. So internet is a medium, but it's not the reason of the protests. We saw that Putin's popularity dropped dramatically in 2004, 2005, and where the internet was not so widespread as it is now. It's the first reason. So Putin sees that internet, yes, it is the American project that American special services can use for the regime changes. But in case of Russia, the broad national consensus is not endangered by the development of the internet. So there's no rational reason to block popular social media and platforms, because for the Russians, it just became the everyday routine. No propaganda can explain to the average people. So it's not an instrument for the elite or for dissenters or for journalists. It's just everyday routine for every Russian to be in all kinds of international and local mirrors of internet resources. So the risk to deprive Russians of these things they are used to are compared or even bigger than the risk that the critical voices will be widespread through the social media. The second reason why internet is still relatively free is that Putin is natural capitalist. He's dreaming about the glory, military glory, and glory and external influence of the old time of Soviet Union in the international sphere. But in the economy, he's not dreaming about restoring old-style Soviet planned economy. And he's convinced, or the people around him, with some exemptions, of course, are convinced that you cannot separate the modern market economy and the internet. So losing the internet, you actually stop being a market economy. So that's two reasons of several. There are minors to why internet is still alive in Russia and why it's still not on the Chinese way, although some steps were being made to make it, let's say, more Chinese in recent years. But, well, the questions will be, well, better answered.
I came with some remarks also about the state of the Russian internet and new media technologies, some of which Natalia and Alexander have already made, so what I'll try to do is fill in some of the details. But first I want to just make sure everybody's on the same page and understanding that Facebook, Kontakte, and Twitter, although they did greatly facilitate democratic protests during the Snow Revolution, for instance, in Russia. Can everyone hear me okay? These technologies weren't designed as tools for democratization. So to assume that they are by nature democratizing forces to fall into the fallacy of technological determinism. One media scholar, Pierre Levy, put it nicely: a technology is produced within a culture, and a society is conditioned by its technologies, conditioned, not determined. So it's natural that technologies and infrastructures evolve in different ways depending on the surrounding political and cultural and economic environment. Since Putin's third term, as we've already heard, it's obvious that the trend has been toward greater state control in creating what I think we would hear Putin call a more sovereign internet. And these trends have certainly made it more difficult for journalists to practice. But they are also prone to changing. And it is, nevertheless, still possible, as my predecessors have said, to find oppositional voices. The question these days seems to be not whether to restrict, but how much state control should there be. And I want to give a couple of recent events that provide two different implicit answers to this question. On April 14th, over 200 FSB officers and staff raided the Moscow headquarters of Mikhail Prokhorov's Anexum Group, which owns majority shares in RBK, one of Russia's oldest and most cited, i.e. most influential online news outlets. Though authorities to date have been quiet about the rationale, observers suggest it's likely connected to the RBK investigations into and reporting into the business practices of Putin's friends through the Panama Papers and his alleged family members, as Natalia was referring to. The subsequent rumors that of the impending sale of RBK to Putin's friend Yuri Kovalchuk corroborates this story, or this version of the story. Now, the second item came 4 days later in the form of an op-ed piece by Investigations Committee head Alexander Bastrykin on the pages of Kommersant Vlast, in which he advocated that the state stop, quote, playing at false democracy, end quote, and buckle down against what he referred to as the absolute freedom and lawlessness by setting up an effective barrier to the information war, those are his words, being waged upon Russia by the United States. So the centerpiece for this proposal was, quote, the sensible determination of the boundaries of censorship of the global internet in Russia, as convoluted in Russian as my translation reflects here, with the aim of defending the national information space. So I'd like to spend the time I have remaining explaining why I think the first of these two scenarios has been to date the preferred path and will in all likelihood continue to be the path in Putin's Russia. And if I have time, touch on some of the implications for the internet as a tool for promoting civil society. So outright censorship of the Bastrykin sort really is no longer viable, I think. That's the main problem. You cannot recreate a Glavlit sort of scenario. Architecturally, even if it were possible to introduce something akin to the Great Firewall of China, which actually may be easier in Russia than many people think, the internet and social networks are fundamentally different from print, radio, and television. They're structured in a decentral fashion, a rhizomatic fashion, making it exceedingly difficult to censor every site, post, tweet, or retweet of every individual user. Yes, authorities can make it difficult to access posts of select troublemakers, such as Alexei Navalny, but as Andrei Soldatov and Irina Baragan recently pointed out in their book, The Red Web, when Russian soldiers in the Donbass themselves are posting photos and updates to Vkontakte through their mobile devices, we don't need Navalny to tell us that they are there and that they are waging war. Financially, as Alexander referred to, the internet-based economy is one of the most dynamic and fastest growing sectors of the Russian national economy. Russia's top two most profitable tech companies, aside from those that export military equipment, both come from the IT sector, Mail.ru Group and Yandex, the search engine. According to the president's special advisor to the internet, German Klimenko, The internet is a catalyst for Russia. It's the oil, it's like oil for the economy. So imposing hard censorship would severely weaken that catalyst. And then finally, culturally, at least two generations of internet users, including many among the political elite, have become used to a relatively free and open flow of information that it provides. Internet penetration as of the end of 2015 is now at 67% by one count, including virtually the entire population between the ages 12 and 45 living in cities of over 1 million residents. Trying to put this virtual genie back in the bottle would likely be more trouble than it's worth. But it really isn't all that necessary, I would again argue, even from the perspective of a Putin administration keen on maintaining power and stability or ensuring a greater internet sovereignty, as they call it. Legislatively, since 2012, over 24 laws have been put on the books designed to contain perceived web-based threats, regulating everything from ownership and data storage to online financial transactions and retweets. Right? Now people are doing jail time for reposting and retweeting. Two examples just came up this week. Economically, the RBK takeover is only the latest in a string of transfers of influential web-based media to Kremlin-friendly hands. In just a short span of 2013, the VKontakte founder Pavel Durov was forced out, Lenta.ru editor Galina Timchenko was fired, and the largely independent RIA Novosti, although supported by the government, was liquidated and restructured into Россия Сегодня and Sputnik, headed by the infamous Dmitry Kiselyov. We've seen a similar consolidation in the telecom industry, with state-owned Rostelecom becoming the preferred vehicle for expanding broadband to the regions and realizing such e-government initiatives as a state-run search engine Sputnik, a Russian-created state-controlled competitor to Skype, still in the works, and the recently launched state-run anti-corruption portal, which they call Play by the Rules, Играй по правилам. And architecturally, in September 2014, Kremlin officials did briefly float the idea of introducing a kill switch and closing off the Russian language internet from the global internet, but then backed off, proposing instead to create a sort of multi-tiered access to regional, national, and international content with increasingly restrictive oversight at each level. At the same time, Russia continues to lead the charge on the international front to decentralize US-led administration of the internet and give individual countries greater sovereignty over their regional domains. And finally, as Soldatov Baragan and Yevgeny Morozov have all pointed out, new media technologies turn out to be exceptionally convenient ways for governments to keep tabs on their own populations. Edward Snowden has pointed this out as well, of course. So there may even be a national security-based reason to keep the channels relatively open and free. So to conclude, in my mind, this combination of legislative, economic, and architectural measures are more than sufficient to contain significant web-based threats, or so perceived, with less potential backlash than were Bastrykin, more draconian measures adopted. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm sort of the fifth wheel in this media-heavy panel. Lynn, when she invited me, kindly suggested that I talk about the policy perspective, being from Washington and from the 1700 block of Massachusetts Avenue, this concentration of think tank and policy expertise. So I'll take a stab at that. I had the pleasure of speaking here in this auditorium about 2 years ago, in February of 2014. And looking back, it seems like that was a relatively okay time, given the state of the relationship in our policy toward Russia these days. That was before Russia annexed Crimea. So there is this sort of sense now that until March of 2014, things were more or less okay. But if you look at the record of the last 4 administrations, counting Obama's, it really becomes quite obvious that the relationship has not been in a good repair since perhaps a brief moment during the Bush-Gorbachev days or Reagan-Gorbachev days that Professor Cohen referred to in his remark. And there's a persistent pattern here. If you look at the record of the Bush 41 presidency, it ended in disappointment. Yes, we won the Cold War, but the partner that we had hoped the Soviet Union would become with the New World Order emerging as a result of the new partnership of the 2 former adversaries, that never materialized, and there was a real concern about the breakup of the Soviet Union and its consequences, not just for the people of the Soviet Union, but also for the neighboring countries. We were anticipating multiple Yugoslavias, loose nukes, and other such nightmare scenarios, millions of refugees flooding Europe from Russia this time, not from the Middle East. So the Clinton administration came in full of hopes and aspirations for a new relationship, for a new Marshall Plan-like program of aid to Russia, and for deep involvement in Russian domestic reforms. That's something that Professor Cohen referred to in his remarks. And for a while it lasted. It was okay. The partnership worked between Bill and Boris. But that too ended in 2001 on a note of profound disappointment with Vladimir Putin, this gray KGB apparatchik emerging in the footsteps of the colorful Boris Yeltsin, and beginning to turn the screws on civil society and free media in Russia. So then there was Bush 43, and it began on a sour note, but then it blossomed into a partnership between the 2 presidents, and there was cooperation apparently in a number of areas and aspirations for even more. But that too ended on a sour note in 2008 after the Georgian War. And now Obama. So we had the reset in 2009, again, new hopes, 2 new presidents, young lawyers, Obama and Medvedev. Of course, Putin has legal education too, on a grand note of modernization of the 2 societies coming closer together. And that too is ending now as we speak, especially if you sort of read a recent spate of interviews by, well, the recent piece. I'll put in a plug for the New York Times about Ben Rhodes. I recommend it highly to those of you who haven't seen about the foreign policy making in the Obama administration. Hooray, New York Times, really good reporting. But also the now famous Jeffrey Goldberg interview, where Obama opens up about his views on many foreign leaders and many aspects of his foreign policy. And there's a sense that basically he doesn't want to deal with Russia. He's had enough. It's for the next administration to deal with. And we're now, sadly, at a point where perhaps the best hope for an improved relationship between Russia and the United States rests on Donald Trump. And he, again, to cite Professor Cohen, is the only one of the major presidential candidates who in the course of his campaign felt that it was necessary to address the issue of Russia and U.S. policy toward Russia. And, given the relative lack of attention to Russia in our presidential campaign, might say, well, do we really need Russia? And there's a lot to be said, of course, about Russia not being anywhere near as important as it once was. After all, especially with the drop in the price of oil and decline of Russian currency, its GDP is only about 1.2, 1.4 trillion dollars. The population is about 140 some million people, and apparently declining. It really plays on its legacy as a sort of heir to the Soviet fame, seat at the United Nations, and its formidable geographic position astride Eurasia. But other than that, anywhere we look, Russia emerges as a source of problems and frictions in our bilateral relationship. We see, as a result of Russia's actions, breakdown in the European security order, something we worked for 25 years, and it didn't work. It broke down with the collapse of Ukraine, of the deal in Ukraine. So we're now looking at the remilitarization of our relationship with Russia in Europe. Russia is not really a major player in Asia, where we see the United States pivoting or trying to pivot over time. And in terms of our economic and trade relationship, there's not a whole lot of trade. Even in the good years, I think the high, our trade bilaterally with Russia was only about $40 billion. So it's not all that much. Yet Russia occupies a uniquely important position. It has the nuclear arsenal, which is really second to none. It could be a source of stability in Europe and in the Middle East. And our ability in many ways to reach an understanding with Russia has run into a real gap, perceptual, conceptual gap between our worldview and the way in which Russian elites perceive the outside world. And it permeates virtually every aspect of our bilateral relationship, from the fate of Assad and how Secretary Kerry and Foreign Minister Lavrov talk about the future of Syria, to actually the state and the future of the internet. We have staked out diametrically opposing positions in our views, in our international positions, in negotiations about the future in the internet and the ability of sovereign states to control their sovereign internet space, to the extent that that term really makes any sense. I don't really understand the internet, let's put it this way. I don't even have a Facebook account. And I see that as, continuing, and the internet really, the media, not just the internet, becoming one of the major battlefields of this new Cold War-like state between Russia and the United States. For us, the fundamental principles of freedom and boundary, borderless media and freedom of exchange of information is one of the fundamental aspects of our worldview, really. It's essential to our understanding of who we are and how we would like to see the international community, the world, organized. For Russia, it is exactly the opposite view, and the sense of insistence on having sovereign control that Michael referred to is essential to their being, to their sense of well-being, to the sense of security, national security. It's going to be a very difficult relationship in that sense. In part, not necessarily because Russia is so important in the media space. After all, Russian internet is not all that important for us politically, commercially, and otherwise. But because of Russia, perhaps disproportionate influence, partnership with China, and an increasing coalition of international partners who like the idea of enhancing sovereign control over their own media space, that presents a serious challenge to the United States, I think, in our information policy, in our foreign policy. And in the last few years, especially in the last couple of years, since the complete breakdown in the relationship between us and Russia. You've seen a number of proposals, we've seen a number of proposals in Washington to recreate our own information, for the lack of a better term, I'll say warfare, information operations apparatus beyond the Voice of America, something akin to the United States Information Agency, something that would project our worldview onto the world stage. And I find that really to be a very unpromising area for our policy to really engage in. I think our record on combating violent extremism in cyberspace leaves a lot to be desired. I defer to Ambassador Benjamin here to talk about that. He's probably has some scars to show from his experience in government on that set of issues. But any time our government really engages in this effort, it tends to backfire. We tend to do something clumsy, bureaucratic, that really doesn't reach a whole lot of people beyond the Beltway. One of the difficult, and I'm about to finish here, one of the difficult aspects of this is that our record in this area during the Cold War was extremely successful. The record of the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and others, you know, BBC, British Broadcasting Service, of course, not a US activity, but allied with us, is unparalleled in terms of reaching key audiences inside the Soviet Union and shaping the attitudes, the thinking of hundreds of thousands of millions of people behind the Iron Curtain. The difference between then and now is that in those days, the societies behind the Iron Curtain were deprived of information. Our outreach to them was not propaganda. It was honest, fair and balanced reporting from the free world, providing them with information that they otherwise could not obtain. There was a great hunger for it. I can speak to it from my personal experience. There's plenty of information. Yeah, sorry?
Exactly. I can confirm whatever you say.
There's plenty of information out there now, and that's the challenge for us. We want them to get to the information we like, not necessarily others. And I think that will continue to be a battle space for us for a long time. Sorry if I went over time.
Well, so I want to thank all of our panelists for their remarkably interesting and diverse comments, and also for the degree of self-censorship that they showed in limiting their remarks, self-censorship here being a good thing. I know that we're running a little bit over time because we have been starting late, but I wanted to make sure that we had some time for questions, because I'm sure there are many for the different panelists here. Rest assured there will still be time for lunch. So I will, hopefully we have folks walking around with the microphones. If you could, when you ask your question, if you have a particular panelist you would like to direct it to, please make that clear. If you would like to ask it in general to the panel, we will try to figure out who would most like to answer you.
I think the question I have, I think, is mainly directed towards Natalia, Alexander, and Michael, sort of on, you both gave kind of two sides of this thing. On the one hand, definitely a freer information environment than in other non-democratic countries, and you all three seem to be suggesting that's probably going to stay the case, but there are all these other things happening that are antithetical to the idea of, you know, full freedom of expression. And I hate to make a pun, but I still wasn't clear where your net assessment was. I mean, I think it's relatively positive, but could you just explain, like, in really concrete terms, if I'm a Russian interested in politics and I want to create like a website, and I'm just some guy and living in some city, and I'm gathering information, and I'm, you know, kind of doing a Navalny type thing, what's the experience like for a person who is not maybe even, but where there might be things that the government is sensitive about? I mean, what do I face as a young, or it doesn't have to be young, as any age, I just assume they're young, a person trying to establish a kind of big a blog or a presence that is potentially critical?
Oh, well, it's changing, of course, but we had several successful launches of, let's say, personal political website. One of them was like more nationalist, so Sputnik and Pogrom. It's a personal, basically personal media. Started, remind me how long ago, 3 years ago? 3 years ago by just a young journalist of kind of enlightened nationalist views, not very enlightened sometimes, but nevertheless it's not kind of Nazi nationalism, it's thinking nationalism. So we had these cases. The problem is that when you grow big, the state starts paying attention to you. And all cases mentioned by my colleague is, I mean, the firing of the editor-in-chief of Lenta.ru, Lenta.ru, or an attempt to change the owner of RBC or RBK, I don't know how it is pronounced here, are, first of all, because of the size. They had an audience of more than 1 million visitors a day. So they were comparable with the biggest major national newspapers and sometimes more influential than TV channels. So if you are a club media, so more specialized media, like one of the reasons that I'm working one year in Carnegie.ru, which has all, I mean, preconditions to be, I don't know, approached by the state, probably, yes, but we are not great, we are not big enough. And there are many political websites working freely just because of their size. The society needs exactly the free flow of information. There are many people in all stratas or in all political conventions that are used to read not just their own view, but the opposite, so the view, the critical voices. So what the state is afraid of, that these critical voices not go too widespread. So if a young man starts a website, it probably has a long time to grow to something nationwide and something influential. So in this period, there is no big danger. But it depends on, many things depends in what region, of course. Because it's sometimes, or very often, it's much easier to criticize Putin or the central government than to criticize the local government on the level of the town or the region. And there are regions, of course, which is less possible or almost impossible, like Chechnya. That's just beyond any question. Or there are regions where independent media survives or trying to survive.
May I please add?
Yes.
Alexander mentioned Igor Prospernin website. I have to say that he is under the criminal charge now by the Article 282 of the Criminal Code of Russian Federation. Возбуждение, it's called, please help me out with the translation. Возбуждение ненависти либо вражды, а равно унижение человеческого достоинства. For hate speech, yeah. So he can be charged for 3 years. So I would say that you never know. It depends on who you are and who is watching you and where you are physically, in which region, what the mood of the governor on this morning. So you never know. But I see a general consensus, and I agree with Alexander that there is some sort of consensus that you do not have to be big to be free. So if you have a huge audience, you should be put under the control. So our most free media are not that popular among the population.
Question in the middle.
To Natalia and Alexander again, with the disclosures that came out with Edward Snowden, I'm curious as to what the perceptions are from the other side of the pond as to how free American journalism may be or how open-minded we are in terms of criticism of our government.
My perception of the freedom of the journalist in America. That was the question. Well, my perception is, the experience of my reading is that it is, of course, the long tradition of, well, the freedom. And, you know, but when American media are writing about the outside world, they obviously make some simplifications. It's not censorship or self-censorship, but any text of any journalist, by any journalist, has some points of, and some entrances. You cannot, if you are reading about a foreign country, you have to, something familiar to start with. I can call it the entry, or точка входа, the point of the entrance of a text. And for American audience, for the Western audience, there are several familiar points about Russia that can be used as these doors to the text. You cannot just begin with something unfamiliar. And the number of these doors is small. Gazprom, KGB, I don't know, Putin, now Ukraine. Are a few things that can provoke the interest of readership. That's why if you are reading texts about Russia, of course they are terribly simplified for us. But I can imagine, and you have not to have a great imagination to see what impression our text about America, about the United States, can produce, or can on Americans. They are terribly simplified too, and sometimes consciously simplified. Well, my perception is, of course, that, you know, in Russia there is something that, обратный карго-культ, I don't know how to translate. Обратный карго-культ. I mean, Russian says that we don't have democracy. Okay, we agree. But Americans and elsewhere in the West don't have democracy too. And then they are trying to convince themselves, searching the examples in the American media. And when they find these simplifications, they see, look, they just make propaganda like us, they make information wars like us. But they are not conscious information wars, but they are used as a pretext to do something alike consciously, probably. Wait. I don't know. That's good.
I just wanted to, Natalia, did you want to say something, or? Yeah,
I think that our propaganda try to pursue people that American media are the same as us, so there is no free media, and there is no such thing as free media in general. Personally, of course, I do believe that the New York Times is more free than than Российская газета to criticize their authorities, their president. I don't know. You have a long tradition of free speech in the country, so I personally don't understand it.
Well, I don't want to create any impression of equivalency between Russian and American media, and I want to say that, you know, I'm glad there is the New York Times. I'm a subscriber and a reader, but at the same time, you know, there's been and we all see this, we all know this, incredible realignment in our media. A lot, you know, the New York Times has the resources to maintain foreign bureaus. A lot of our major publications no longer maintain foreign bureaus. I already mentioned before, but I draw your attention again to the piece about Ben Rhodes in the New York Times. And it's an incredibly interesting piece because he, you know, blatantly talks about manipulating the media and feeding a handful of pocket reporters, essentially. Some of them, I assume, probably from the New York Times, some of the names I see on Twitter regularly, are being fed the line from the White House. And the White House manipulating the media space, manipulating the story, shaping the narrative, I think that's the term he uses, to suit the White House's political interest. And I think that's something that really is very troubling, and that, you know, our media has become a lot more, there's a much greater intermarriage, so to speak, and sometimes actual marriage between our senior political leaders, our government officials, and members of the Fourth Estate.
I would just make mention of the fact that outside of the United States, the U.S. is perceived as being the largest single threat to world peace. And we don't get very much of that in our media. And so an outside perception becomes kind of really interesting to pursue.
Now, you know, one thing that I would suggest is that our reporters and editors especially insist on it. You know, they drop the practice of quoting unnamed White House senior officials who are not authorized to speak on record about a particular issue. If you're not authorized to speak about it, don't speak about it.
I would like to add one more thing, that a TV channel called Russia Today, RT, which works here in the US, made I think it's their main point, that they show to the American audience here, right? Their language is English, so they work for the American audience. So they show everything what mainstream media do not show. So if you want to see to see anything, to see something which is different from American mainstream media, I would refer to RT.
One question was if I mean, for the panel, if the West should engage itself in informational war with Russia, since the Russian informational war, because it belongs to the state and is directed by the state, is effective, so probably the West is losing. It's a completely wrong idea. That's clear. Those in outside the West, those in unfree countries that who trust for the Western and American media do it because, exactly as Eugen says, during the Soviet time, and I was myself listening to BBC World Service and Voice of America. BBC was better, by the way. It was not a voice of counter-propaganda. Mm-hmm. It was just a human voice and a professional way to bring the news and the information and the analysis. Otherwise, we have, for instance, we have the situation in Ukraine now, when there is unspoken consensus among journalists that since Russia has engaged itself in proxy war and information war against Ukraine, the Ukrainians should do the same. not just in state-owned media, and they don't have a lot of them. Most of them are private, but even good journalists applied to themselves this kind of self-censorship. Don't write or don't tell anything that could be helpful for Russians and their propaganda. Of course, it's not possible. Of course, they do. But the general idea of Ukrainian media is tarnished by this. I mean, you cannot trust them completely because they have declared themselves in an informational war. So when you read something in Ukrainian media, so when I'm not just read, as an editor-in-chief, I'm in search of good writers in Ukraine, and I'm never sure, even those who were reliable before, I have doubts about them now, because how honestly they will analyze the situation. Because there is this idea that we are in war, and information is not just information, but it's something we have to change according to the situation. So the same can be with the Western media in the eyes of the rest of the world, if the Western media or the West as a politically declare information counter-propaganda war against or Russia Today or Sputnik or Russian state media. What makes American media influential is exactly the fact they have simplifications and have mainstream topics, and probably don't allow some topics easily to be covered, but they are not at war. They are just media.
This gentleman's been waiting to ask a question.
Well, again, it's a follow-on to your comments on self-censorship, and it's addressed to both you and Natalia. You know, we're all aware of at least one contract killing of a journalist in years past, and to what extent is the concern about personal physical harm influencing journalists at all, if at all, in the present day? Is that still a consideration? Is there intimidation because of concern over physical harm?
I have not such feeling that journalists really have threats of being physically attacked. I do not, but I see the very well-known media theory about spiral silence. So it works now in Russia. It's really hard to oppose under those circumstances. And I do not want to mention the media outlet, but I've had a talk with the guy from there recently, and I was shocked by his understanding on what's going on in his media, and it's one of the last remaining free media in the country. He says that it should be one very critical article, which probably shouldn't apply personally to Vladimir Putin, but it can be one very critical article, and then it has to be some time after it when the media outlet won't do another critical one. So time lag from one article to the second one is growing. That's what he says.
About the personal threat, well, the personal threat is for life and health in numbers is not bigger than during the 90s. During the 90s, there was speech and media freedom, but the situation was a bit like in Mexico when different mafia groups or a group of influence inside and outside the government could punish or even kill journalists. And well, there are as many cases of journalists murdered during the 90s as now. Only, well, the angle changed, the source of danger changed. At that time, the source of danger, of physical danger was, criminal world becoming the owner of enterprises, so local governors, local rulers, local mafias, and sometimes corrupt officials. Now there are corrupt officials, local rulers, and the new thing that happened after the Crimea annexation and even earlier, there are different non-state violent patriotic groups. Because after the Moscow protests of 2011-2012, the government tried to make the regime, to make the type of authoritarianism that exists in Russia more dynamic, so to engage more supporter to non-sanctioned volunteer, такой самодеятельный, how to say, self-initiated activities. And many of these activities are led against independent journalists or human rights activists or LGBT activists. It's a relatively new phenomenon that started mostly in 2012 probably, and the peak was in 2014. Now I see this tendency a bit decreasing. We have to check it and to watch more, but well.
So we're almost out of time. We have time for one final question, and then unfortunately we will have to break for lunch.
Thank you very much. Maybe a question to Alexander, but also to Natalia. If you could elaborate more on the issue of working with journalists from Ukraine and how you see that they are now seem to be more biased, maybe. From my perspective, I think, it seems to me at least, it's easy to discern who are maybe kind of pro-nationalist or at least kind of nationalistically oriented people and who are the disillusioned journalists or intellectuals in Ukraine, mostly disillusioned with the stance of Russian journalists not being courageous enough to speak up to the situation that was happening both in the Crimea and in eastern Ukraine, not being disillusioned with lack of solidarity with the same journalists in Ukraine, especially those who fled from eastern Ukraine and from Crimea, from whole organizations in the Crimea that are now facing either closures or have been closed effectively already and basically had to flee the peninsula, and so on. So if you could maybe just briefly elaborate on that.
In two words, in Russia, something is easier to understand where to search for reliable and independent journalism. So there is a state media with, and the media who are that are independent are trying to be independent. In Ukraine, it's just more difficult to decide where to go to find a reliable reporting. And well, I just worked with some journalists from Ukraine, Slon, that were completely honest and reliable before, but something happened during, Maidan and months and years after, and I had to drop cooperation because they got this perception that if they are writing for a Russian media, they cannot be, completely sincere because they are writing about their own country for a foreign country that is in war with them. So you cannot be sincere, clear, and actually you have to mutilate information a bit. It's like,
I don't see why they cannot be sincere, and they have been sincere at many times.
Sincerity is not the most important quality in this. You can be in sincere anger, and many Russian propagandists are very sincere too. Some of them are cynical, of course, and many of them are cynical. And if you go and, I have friends and acquaintances in ITAR-TASS or in some other state agency, the corridors there are full of people very critical towards this happening in Russia and the way of its government. So It's a national mobilization that just make ну такой, как сказать, the analysis more different.
Unfortunately, I am going to have to take on the role of censor now, but a censor because of time, which we are most unfortunately out of.
Censorship always has an excuse.
Right. Yes, it does. But lunch is one of its best excuses. Thank you all again to all of the panelists as well as to the audience. I am sorry only that we did not have more time for this discussion. Petra, you're going to tell us what's happening next. First of all, round of applause for
For our conference participants, lunch is but you can follow us to get there, and it's already ready. So I would like to encourage us to walk over, and then we can continue the conversation.
Right.